Clearly, in that one-day summit, only a limited set of perspectives, topics, themes, disciplines can be represented. This afternoon, we will have 3 presenters, take a break, and then have 2 more. Again, continuing on a different and broader range of perspectives, and that will all continue through future
Goodbye.
weeks. Bye-bye. It's been nice. It's pardon? Got it. In many ways, we can think of the white papers that were solicited as part of this same theme. There's input coming to the committee from various sources, the 30-plus white papers submitted. So all of this is material that the committee will be processing, filtering, sorting, discussing as we get down to our serious deliberations over an extended period of time here. But for now, our research panel, so the theme for the afternoon is how does research in political science and social and political psychology provide insight into issues of national security and intelligence analysis? The 3 presenters for the first piece of this panel, I'll introduce them all at the same time, and then so that I'm not hopping up and down and we can move on. Thank you all for coming. So first we have Bear Braumuller, Department of Political Science at Ohio State. My alma mater, yes, okay. And researches in the area of international relations, especially international security and statistical methodology. Next, we will have Sarah Kroko, Department of Government and Politics and faculty associate at the Center for International Development and Conflict Management at the University of Maryland. Research focusing on international conflict, processes by which citizens assign leaders responsibility for wars, territorial disputes, civilian targeting. Third will be Michael Desch, Professor of Political Science, Founding Director of the Notre Dame International Security Center. And before that, the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. I'm so happy the 3 of you are able to be with us this afternoon. First, we'll turn it over to Dr. Braumuller.
All right. Thank you very much. And I just want to make sure that okay, the clicker works, good. I'm here today to talk a bit about systemic theory in international relations and some of the potential applications it might have to the work that all of you are doing. To make my terms clear from the onset, systemic theory in international relations is about theorizing the impact of agents on structures and vice versa. And many fields have some equivalent of systemic theory, especially those that do a lot of complex systems research in which individuals interact with their environment. In international relations, the agents are typically taken to be the states, most often the major powers. The structure of the international system in general is distributions of things that matter to the states. So balance of power theory is kind of the canonical systemic theory in international relations, but in principle could be just about anything. Those of you who have read Giles Milton's book, Nathaniel's Nutmeg, know that for a while the distribution of nutmeg was very important to the major powers because they believed that it cured the plague. So I'm relatively agnostic in my own work about what distributions matter to great powers. Typically, balances of power and ideology are take pride of place, but that's not always necessarily the case. Now, the history of systemic theory in international relations is interesting in a couple of ways. It started actually with the work of Ludwig von Bertalanffy, who was one of the founders of general systems theory, and some of you may have encountered his work, or at least heard him mentioned in your own areas. Just because general systems theory was so prominent both in its ambitions, sort of to unify science around a general idea of understanding systems, and in its spectacular failure to do so, largely because it set its sight on attempting to find isomorphisms, that is, systemic configurations or systemic rules or laws that carried across from the natural sciences to the physical sciences to the social sciences. However, the general framework of systemic theory, the overall perspective carried through to modern complex systems research and which has been considerably more fruitful. There's a long history of systemic theory and international relations dating back at least to Morton Kaplan's book from 1957, System and Process in International Relations. I've listed a few more here, including my own book at the bottom. Since I'm giving the talk, I get to list my own book. So I did a bibliography not too long ago, one of those Oxford bibliographies of systemic theory. And so I took a number of the citations from that and kind of arranged them to give a sense of where exactly they lie along the dimensions of analytical rigor and the coherence of the underlying mechanism that was elaborated. These are qualitative judgments. They're entirely my own. And so the lower left corner might colorfully be referred to with a term that John Weltman came up with, metaphoric hypertrophy. Really lots of big, woolly, exciting sounding metaphors that are difficult, if not impossible, to operationalize. The upper right-hand corner is getting closer to something that I think people from other disciplines would recognize as systemic theory, and we've had sort of everything in between. I was hoping when I made this graph that I'd be able to draw a nice, neat line from the lower left to the upper right and show that there's progress. That didn't turn out to be the case, in part because some people like Stuart Bremer wrote some very prescient research years and years ago that ended up not getting the recognition I think that it was due. What I did notice, however, is that you could usefully divide these works up into, for lack of a better term, I'll call tribes. You have the sort of traditional IR folks in red, the English school systems theorists in blue, and then the folks who attend the annual Peace Science Society meeting in green. It's not too much of an exaggeration to say that the folks in red and blue are the ones who do the archival research, and the folks in green are the ones who run regressions, to give you sort of a sense of what the division is. And that's not entirely, I think nowadays there's become less of a division, which is a good thing, but I didn't want to try to blend the colors to make that more confusing. Also interesting, when I took a look at the Peace Science crowd, which is my tribe, was the fact that there's a striking gap in the history of systemic theory. The 1990s and the 2000s are almost devoid of research in systemic theory, and the 1980s were no great shakes either. So the question is, what happened in that period? And I think a couple of things happened. First of all, we all became smitten with regression, like everybody else, and we were firm believers in the idea that all you have to do is put all your control variables on the right-hand side, and magically you'll get an unbiased causal effect out of your regression equation. We're waking up a little bit from that perspective. Also, there's a terrific and I think more generally underappreciated store of data in international relations. We've been producing data sets for quite some time. The Correlates of War, I think, started with their alliance data set in the 1960s. J. David Singer got a grant from the National Institutes of Health because war kills people, I guess, and started building what has become sort of the juggernaut of international relations data projects. There's also the International Crisis Behavior Data Set. There are a lot of events data projects. Most of them started by Phil Schroet, who's terrific. These measure the kinds of events that occur between countries, and they've gotten it to the point now where data collection is automated and they can actually get very recent, very reliable data. So international relations has been very rich, has a very rich tradition in data gathering. The problem is that most of these data sets were particularly well suited to dyadic studies of conflict. So most of the studies that have been carried out in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s have been about conflicts between pairs of states, and systemic theory has sort of fallen into the background. So I wanted to give, with that background, I want to talk a little bit about my own contribution to the systemic theory literature by way of an illustration of the kinds of things that that we do in political science, or that I do at least. It elaborates a fully systemic theory of international relations. I mean, I went to great pains to try to figure out how to get the structure of the system to interact with the agents and vice versa. In a nutshell, the arguments are fairly straightforward, that dissatisfaction with the structural status quo prompts states to act in proportion to that dissatisfaction, and that states change structure in proportion to their dissatisfaction and their capabilities. Right, so these are the kinds of fairly simple actor-level assumptions that that produce sometimes surprising global outcomes. And that's the case because everybody's actions influences the system at the same time. So here we're talking about from 1815 to 1991, which is the range of the study and the range of the data. The structural variables are the balance of power, the balance of political ideology, and after World War I, arms levels. As you saw, a conscious effort to try to limit arms levels, given the perception that arms races had been a major cause of World War I. Whoops, I am ahead of myself here. Gave away my next slide. And the agents are the great powers. Obviously, not all the great powers in all the time periods. We didn't have Italy during World War II, during the Cold War, for example. And the way that the model is set up, you have reciprocal interaction between the agents and the structure over time. So at time zero, or at time one, the structure affects the agents and vice versa. At time two, same thing happens, and so on and so forth. The theory is formalized as a set of, sorry, I keep having to look over my shoulder, a set of differential equations. And the best way to think about this is to think about sort of macroeconomic models as they were done until fairly recently. With fewer, it doesn't have sort of 20 or 30,000 equations like some of the big projects used to. But it's the same sort of idea where you've got multiple systems of equations. Estimated by full information maximum likelihood. I was glad to hear the earlier panel. There was support for case studies because I'm a firm believer in case studies myself, and wanted to look at the history of great power interactions and make sure that what I was seeing on the ground actually corresponded to what was going on in the model. As I said, we have lots of data in international relations, and I was able to use available data from most of this. Where I wasn't able to gather data, I did a survey of diplomatic historians, and then ran the answers in the survey through various statistical procedures to assure myself that there was actually a there, and that the answers weren't random or unrelated to one another. In any presentation like this, you have to have a table with stars. So here's the table with stars. It's customary in systems of equations to look at equation level significance. When I ran this model and looked at the output from 181 equations, I realized why that's the case. So the equation ended up testing out reasonably well across time periods, with the exception of the balance of ideology in the 19th century, which is kind of an interesting case, because the great powers didn't really have that much of an influence over the balance of ideology. But talk about that separately. The next question is sort of when you get past the star table and everything else, does this really, do the results of the model pass the eyeball test? Do they give you some results that you can meaningfully understand and look at and say, gee, this sort of makes sense? So what I've done here is I've plotted some vector fields which show the equilibrium tendency of the system at any given point in time. Along the x-axis is British activity, along the y-axis is German activity. The years are 1890, 1905, 1914. If we've got the right table, we do. The way that I explain these tables to people who haven't encountered vector fields is that foreign policy scholars can be thought of as boat theorists, systemic theorists can be thought of as river theorists. We're sort of understanding the broad trends that push states in particular directions. They may buck those trends, they may not. But these vector fields give an illustration of the tendency that the system is, sort of the direction in which the system is pushing states. And as you can see, as we go from 1890 to 1905 to 1914, the tendency is for higher and higher levels of activity on part of both the UK and Germany. The interesting thing here is that once you've run the models and derived the vector fields, you can run counterfactual scenarios. So, for example, ask what would happen if Kaiser Wilhelm had not come to power in Germany. Would that have an impact on the subsequent dynamics in the system, right? So that's one of the valuable things about having a set of equations like this is being able to tweak one of the components and see what the implications are for the system years down the line. Another example is isolationism prior to World War II. You see in 1936, the Americans have very little systemic incentive for activity. 1939, still not a whole lot, and then all of a sudden there's a jump in 1940. Now, the problem with this story is that we weren't attacked until December of 1941. So what is this jump in activity in 1940? Well, if you take a close look at the historical data, what you see is that it corresponds very closely to the fall of France, prior to which we hadn't really been as concerned about German capabilities. As Ernie May showed very nicely in his books. I always get it mixed up. He either wrote Strange Victory or Strange Defeat, and I always mix the title up. Sorry? Strange Victory. I knew Jeff would know that. Yeah, Strange Victory. Thank you. So the German victory in France was indeed strange, striking, and surprising. And if you take a look at American public opinion polls before and after the fall of France, before is in blue and after is in red, what you see is a striking increase at that time in support for involvement in World War II. Another sort of a side project here is predicting international conflict. Now, as I mentioned, the model predicts levels of activity. It's agnostic as to the form that that activity will take. A state might arm itself, it might form alliances. It's not entirely clear. You sort of need lower level theory in order to fill you in on you know what form of activity the state will engage in. But I took a look at a couple of lower level theories that predicted conflict. The deterrence model, which argues that conflict arises when a target fails to deter, and the spiral model, which argues that conflict arises when attempts to deter create hostility spirals. And the dilemma is that your best response to a deterrence situation will get you in trouble if you're really in a spiral situation and vice versa. So I was curious to know sort of whether deterrence conflicts or spiral conflicts are more common. I leveraged the patterns of activity that each theory predicts. And if you look at the solid line on the right-hand side, these are militarized interstate disputes among great powers. You can see the small bump on the left indicating that there are some spiral model conflicts, but the larger bump on the right suggests that the deterrence model holds more sway. Just quickly I want to discuss a little bit of work in progress along the same lines. I'm currently finishing up a book on the determinants of systemic levels of conflict. We look a lot at levels of conflict among individual countries, but until Steven Pinker's book came out a few years ago, very few of us really talked much about whether war is in decline. I argue that it's not. But it raises the interesting question, why is it that some historical periods are more conflictual than others? Why is it that the baseline rate of conflict around the world goes up or down? And that could be very interesting if you, say, are a major power that might have some control over the things that increase or decrease the baseline rate of conflict around the world. Also, the determinants of the deadliness of warfare, the origins of international order, which I think it will probably be my next book project. But all of these, in one way or another, relate to systemic models or systemic theories of international relations. So, in conclusion, I wanted to make the bold claim that systemic theorizing is making a comeback. The reality is a few of us are trying, and it's never been the most common sort of thread in international relations research, but it's definitely increasing substantially in recent years, especially with the growth of people doing network theory and more agent-based modeling and so on. And today's problems, I think, are very often systemic in nature. We want to figure out what all the implications of the rise of China are. We want to understand the implications of Brexit and populism and Russian involvement for the future of the Western liberal order. So I think right now, this particular point in history, it strikes me as a very, very good time to be doing systemic theory, because a lot of the questions that we're asking are systemic in nature. And I just put that last line up there to indicate that national academies, I think, can help, because in some ways, systemic research is probably more familiar to people in other fields than it is in some cases to people in political science. So I'm hoping that you all will have some knowledgeable and ideally friendly reviewers in your journals to help us refine our arguments. All right, that's it. Thank you very much.